At my granddaughter's wedding, my name tag humiliated me in front of everyone, so I exposed a secret they never saw coming. I didn't say anything when I first saw it, I just stood there near the entrance of the ballroom, holding that small cream-colored card between my fingers as if it might change if I looked at it long enough. The calligraphy was elegant, delicate, beautiful even, the old lady who's paying for everything. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake, a printing error, a mix-up with someone else's card, but deep down, I knew better. I slipped the card onto my dress anyway, and I smiled. I'm glad you're here, stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels, because what happened that night changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The ballroom at the Westbridge Hotel looked exactly like something out of a magazine. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, casting soft golden light across round tables dressed in ivory linens. Each centerpiece was a perfect arrangement of white roses and eucalyptus, just like my granddaughter had always dreamed, or at least, what I had helped her dream. I had paid for the venue, the flowers, the catering, the string quartet now playing softly near the stage. Every detail had passed through my hands at some point over the past 6 months. Because that's what grandmothers do, isn't it? We make things beautiful, quietly, without asking for recognition. At 68, I wasn't expecting applause, but I wasn't expecting this either. Mrs. Whitmore? I turned to see a young woman at the check-in table smiling at me politely. Is everything all right? She asked. I realized I'd been standing there too long. Oh, yes, I said quickly, forcing a gentle laugh, just taking it all in. It's a beautiful setup. She smiled, relieved, and turned to greet the next guest. I walked further into the room, my heels soft against the polished floor, my posture straight, my expression calm. No one needed to know what was happening inside me, not yet. As I moved through the crowd, I noticed a few glances, subtle at first, a woman's eyes flicking down to my name tag. Then quickly away, a man whispering something to his wife, both of them suppressing a smile, a group of younger guests near the bar exchanging looks before one of them let out a quiet chuckle. I kept walking, I kept smiling, because there's a particular kind of humiliation that doesn't shout, it whispers, it lingers in the air between people, and the worst part is, everyone pretends not to notice. Grandma. Jennifer's voice cut through the noise, bright and cheerful. I turned just in time to see her approaching, her white dress flowing behind her like something out of a dream. For a brief second, my heart softened. She looked beautiful, radiant, everything I had hoped she would be on her wedding day. You made it, she said, wrapping her arms around me. Of course I did, I replied, holding her close for just a moment longer than usual. She pulled back, her eyes scanning my face, then, just briefly, dropping to my name tag. There it was, that flicker, too quick for anyone else to notice, but not for me. Oh, you got your tag, she said lightly. Yes, I answered. A pause, just half a second, then she smiled again, wider this time, brighter. Isn't everything perfect? She asked. I looked around the room, at the chandeliers, the flowers, the guests sipping champagne I had paid for. Yes, I said softly, it's perfect. She squeezed my hand and hurried off, called away by a photographer or a bridesmaid or one of the 100 little details that made up a wedding day, and I stood there, alone again. The music swelled slightly as the quartet transitioned into something more lively, laughter echoed near the bar, glasses clinked, and I became aware of something else, voices, just behind me. Did you see her tag? A whisper, followed by a quiet snicker. I mean, it's not wrong, another voice replied. She paid for all of this, didn't she? Pamela said they thought it would be hilarious. Hilarious. I didn't turn around, I didn't react, but something inside me shifted, slowly, quietly, like a door closing, because in that moment, standing in a room I had built for them, surrounded by people who saw me not as a grandmother, not as family, but as a wallet, I understood. Something I had refused to see for a very long time. This wasn't a joke, it wasn't a misunderstanding, it was deliberate, carefully planned, public, and as I lifted my glass of champagne, my hand steady despite everything, I allowed myself a small, controlled breath. They thought I would stay silent, they thought I would smile, and accept it, and I did smile, but not for the reason they believed, because what they didn't know, was that before I walked into that ballroom, I had already found something that would turn their perfect day into the beginning of their worst nightmare. The next morning, I sat alone at my kitchen table, still in my robe, staring at the name tag I had placed carefully beside my coffee cup, as if it were something fragile or dangerous. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't comfort you, but presses in from all sides, reminding you of what's missing. My husband used to fill the space, his voice, his footsteps, the soft clink of his spoon against his mug as he read the morning paper, but now there was only me, and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic cup, letting the heat seep into my fingers, grounding me, because if I didn't hold on to something steady, I might finally allow myself to feel everything I had been holding back since last night. I hadn't cried at the wedding, not when I saw the tag, not when I heard them laughing, not even when Jennifer looked at it and said nothing, but here, in the quiet of my own kitchen, the memory replayed itself with sharper edges. The whispers, the glances, the way they spoke about me as if I weren't a person, but a role, a function, something to be used and then politely ignored. I exhaled slowly, steady, controlled, because I had learned a long time ago that pain doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes it just sits with you, settling into your bones, waiting until you're ready to understand it. And now, I was starting to understand. This hadn't begun at the wedding. No, the wedding was just the moment everything became visible, the moment the curtain slipped just enough for me to see what had been there all along. I reached for the name tag again, running my thumb over the raised lettering, the old lady who's paying for everything. Such a simple sentence, almost playful on the surface, but underneath it, there was something colder, something intentional. This wasn't just about money, it was about how they saw me, what I had been reduced to over time without even realizing it. An ATM. A resource. A convenience. I set the tag back down carefully and leaned back in my chair, my eyes drifting across the kitchen, every corner of it holding a memory. I remembered Jennifer as a little girl, sitting right there at this table with flour on her cheeks, helping me bake cookies, her laughter filling the room as she insisted on cracking the eggs herself. I remembered the day my son brought his wife home for the first time, how I had welcomed her with open arms, how I had told myself that family grows, it changes, it expands, and that was a beautiful thing. I had believed that. I had believed in them. But belief, I was beginning to realize, can be a very quiet kind of blindness. There had been signs. Small ones. Easy to dismiss. Conversations where decisions were already made before I was even told, financial matters that became too complicated for me to worry about, invitations that came later and later, until sometimes they didn't come at all. I had explained it away every time, told myself they were busy, that life moves fast when you're young, that I shouldn't expect to be at the center of everything forever. That's what a good mother does, isn't it? She steps back. She makes space. She doesn't complain. But somewhere along the way, stepping back had turned into being pushed aside, and I hadn't noticed when the line was crossed. Until last night. I stood up slowly and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to let the morning light spill in. The street outside looked the same as it always did, quiet, ordinary, untouched by the shift that had happened inside me. People were walking their dogs, cars passed by at a steady pace, life continued as if nothing had changed. But something had. I could feel it. Not anger. Not even sadness. Something colder. Clearer. Like a fog lifting after a long time, revealing a landscape I hadn't been able to see before. I turned back toward the table, toward the name tag, and for the first time since the wedding, I allowed myself to think about what came next. Because this wasn't just about humiliation. It was about truth. And truth, once you see it clearly, doesn't let you go back to who you were before. I thought about the conversation I had overheard, the casual way they had spoken about me, as if it were obvious, as if it were agreed upon, as if I had already accepted this role without ever being asked. I thought about Jennifer's face, that brief flicker in her eyes when she saw the tag, not surprise, not confusion, but recognition. She had known. Of course she had known. The realization didn't hit me like a shock, it settled in quietly, like everything else had, piece by piece, until it formed something solid enough that I could no longer ignore it. I walked back to the table and picked up my phone, my fingers hovering over the screen for a moment before unlocking it. There were messages from last night, polite, cheerful, filled with exclamation points and smiling emojis. Thank you so much for everything. The wedding was perfect. We couldn't have done it without you. I stared at those messages for a long second, then slowly set the phone back down. Words are easy. Gratitude is easy, when it costs nothing. I reached into the drawer beside the table and pulled out a small folder, one I hadn't opened in years, the edges worn, the contents neatly organized inside. My husband had always been meticulous about these things, documents, accounts, agreements. He believed in knowing exactly where everything stood, in having clarity, in never leaving important matters to assumption. At the time, I had trusted him to handle it all. Now, I understood why he had insisted. I opened the folder and flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning familiar signatures, official stamps, details I hadn't needed to think about before. But now, every line mattered, every clause, every condition, every decision that had been made long before last night. And then, I found it. The document I hadn't thought about in years. The one he had told me about, quietly, seriously, as if he knew there might come a day when I would need it. I read it once. Then again. Slower this time. And as the meaning settled in, I felt something shift inside me, not a reaction, not an emotion, but a decision. They thought they had defined me. They thought they understood exactly who I was. But they had forgotten something important. I wasn't just the woman who paid for everything. I was the woman who owned everything. And before that day was over, they were going to learn the difference. I didn't wait long before I acted, not because I was in a rush, but because clarity has a way of removing hesitation. By mid-morning, I was already dressed, my posture straight, my expression calm, the same way it had been at the wedding, except this time, there was no confusion left behind it. I picked up my keys, slipped the folder into my handbag, and stepped out of the house without looking back. The drive across town felt strangely peaceful, the kind of quiet that comes when your mind is no longer arguing with itself, when every thought is aligned, every doubt settled. I wasn't going somewhere unfamiliar. I had been there before, years ago, sitting beside my husband as he handled things I never thought I would need to understand on my own. The law office looked exactly the same, understated, professional, almost forgettable if you didn't know what kind of decisions were made inside those walls. The receptionist greeted me politely, her smile warm but neutral, and within minutes, I was led into a private office where a man stood as I entered, older now, his hair more silver than I remembered, but his eyes just as sharp. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, extending his hand, "it's been a long time." I nodded, taking his hand briefly before sitting down, placing my bag carefully beside me. "It has," I replied, my voice steady, "but I believe my husband anticipated that I might need to come back one day." That caught his attention, just slightly, the kind of reaction you only notice if you're looking for it. I opened the folder and slid the document across the desk toward him, watching as his expression shifted from polite professionalism to focused recognition. He didn't speak immediately, just adjusted his glasses and read, line by line, the silence stretching between us but never becoming uncomfortable. I let him take his time, because this wasn't a moment that needed rushing, this was the kind of moment that defined everything that came after. When he finally looked up at me, there was something different in his expression now, not surprise, but confirmation. "You understand what this means," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I answered quietly, "I do now." He leaned back slightly, studying me for a moment as if measuring something unspoken. "And you're ready to proceed?" he asked. I thought about the ballroom, the laughter, the whispers, the name tag resting against my chest like a label I had never agreed to wear. I thought about the years, the quiet sacrifices, the slow erosion of respect that I had mistaken for distance, for change, for life simply moving forward. And then I thought about this moment, sitting here, with the truth laid out clearly in front of me, no longer hidden, no longer optional. "I am," I said. He nodded once, decisive, already reaching for his pen, already shifting into action, and as he began explaining the steps, the legal implications, the changes that would take effect once everything was set in motion, I listened carefully, not overwhelmed, not uncertain, just present. Because this wasn't about revenge, not really, it was about correction, about restoring something that had been quietly taken, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left. Almost. As I stood to leave, the document now no longer just a piece of paper but something active, something real, he paused and looked at me again. They won't expect this, he said. I allowed myself the smallest hint of a smile, not warm, not cold, just certain. No, I replied softly, they won't. I didn't go home right away after leaving the law office, not because I didn't want to, but because I needed a little more time to sit with what I had just set in motion. Instead, I parked across the street from a small cafe my husband and I used to visit on Sunday mornings, long before everything became quiet, long before I had to learn how to carry silence by myself. I stayed in the car for a while, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching people come and go, couples laughing over coffee, a young mother adjusting her child's jacket, life unfolding in simple, ordinary ways. It struck me then how easily things can look normal from the outside, how no one ever sees the quiet shifts happening inside someone else, the moment when a line is crossed, the moment when something changes permanently. I exhaled slowly, steady, not overwhelmed, just aware that the woman sitting in that car was not the same one who had walked into the ballroom the night before. By the time I got home, the afternoon light had softened, stretching long shadows across the living room floor. I set my handbag down carefully, placing it in the same spot I always did, the folder still inside, but now it carried a different weight. My phone lit up almost immediately, messages stacking one after another, Jennifer, my son, even Pamela, all of them filled with the same tone, cheerful, grateful, unaware. We're opening gifts tonight. You have to come, Grandma. Everyone keeps talking about how amazing everything was. I read each message slowly, not reacting, just observing, because there was something almost fascinating about it now, the contrast between their words and what I had seen, what I had heard, what I now understood. I didn't reply. Instead, I walked into the bedroom and opened the closet, my hand brushing past familiar fabrics until it settled on the dress I had worn the night before. I pulled it out, holding it up for a moment, my eyes drifting to where the name tag had been pinned. For a second, the image returned, the whispers, the laughter, the way people had looked at me without really seeing me, and then, it passed. Not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer held power over me in the same way. I folded the dress carefully and set it aside, deliberate, controlled, as if closing a chapter without needing to tear the pages. The house felt different now, not empty, not heavy, just clear. I moved through it slowly, touching small things without thinking, the edge of the dining table, the back of a chair, the picture frame by the hallway, moments of a life that had been built with intention, with care, with love. None of that had changed. What had changed was how it was being seen, how I was being seen, and more importantly, how I was choosing to respond to it. By early evening, another message came through, this time more direct, we're all here, you're the only one missing. I stared at the screen for a moment, then set the phone down again without answering. They expected me to show up the same way I always had, smiling, generous, quietly supporting everything without question. They expected continuity. They expected predictability. They expected the version of me that no longer existed. I walked to the window and looked out at the fading light, the sky shifting into soft shades of gold and blue, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something steady settle in my chest. Not anger, not sadness, but certainty. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself, doesn't need to prove anything, it simply is. They thought last night was the moment that defined me. They were wrong. Last night was just the moment I finally saw them clearly. And tonight, without raising my voice, without creating a scene, without giving them anything they could twist or deny, I was going to begin showing them who I really was. I didn't go that night, not to the gift opening, not to the after party, not to any of the quiet celebrations they assumed I would be part of, Because for the first time in years, I understood that my presence had never really been about me. It had been about what I provided, what I contributed, what I made possible. And without that, I wondered what I actually meant to them. The messages kept coming, first light and cheerful, then slightly confused, then edged with something sharper, something closer to expectation than invitation. Are you okay? Did you get our messages? Everyone's asking where you are. I read them all, one by one, sitting in the same chair by the window, the evening settling around me like a quiet answer. I didn't respond, not because I wanted to punish them, but because I needed to see something clearly, something I had avoided for too long. It didn't take long. By the next morning, the tone had changed. My son called twice before I even finished my coffee, his voice on the voicemail casual at first, then tightening just slightly. "Mom, we missed you last night, you should have come, everyone kept asking about you." A pause, then softer, "You know Jennifer was a little disappointed." Disappointed. I let that word sit with me for a moment, turning it over in my mind, because it was interesting how easily disappointment flowed in one direction, how natural it seemed for them to expect from me without ever questioning what they had given in return. I didn't call him back. Not yet. Instead, I stood up, walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room, and opened the drawer where I kept things I rarely touched anymore, old letters, documents, reminders of decisions made long ago. I took out a notebook, simple, plain, and placed it on the table in front of me. Then, slowly, deliberately, I began to write. Not emotions, not accusations, not anything that could be dismissed as overreaction or misunderstanding, just facts. Dates. Amounts. Contributions. The deposit for the venue. The full payment for catering. The additional costs when they decided to upgrade the floral arrangements. The last-minute expenses they had brushed off with a smile and a "you don't mind, right?" Each line was clear, precise, undeniable. I wasn't doing it for them, not yet, I was doing it for myself, because there is a certain kind of strength that comes from seeing the full picture laid out in front of you, without distortion, without excuses. By the time I finished, the page was full. And for the first time I saw it not as generosity, but as a pattern. I closed the notebook gently and sat back, my hands resting in my lap, my breathing even, steady, because something had shifted again, not dramatically, not emotionally, just, firmly. This wasn't about one wedding, one name tag, one moment of humiliation. This was about years of quiet acceptance, of stepping in when needed, of giving without question, and slowly being reduced to nothing more than that role. And now that I could see it clearly, I could no longer pretend it was anything else. My phone rang again. This time, I answered. "Mom," my son's voice came through, relieved, almost instantly. "Hey, we've been trying to reach you, are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said calmly. There was a small pause on the other end, just long enough for him to register something in my tone, something unfamiliar. "You didn't come last night," he said, not accusing, not yet, just stating it, as if waiting for an explanation that would restore everything to normal. "No," I replied. Another pause. "Well, everyone noticed," he continued, a faint edge creeping into his voice, "Jennifer especially. After everything that was done, after how much effort went into the wedding, it just felt a little strange that you weren't there. After everything that was done." I almost smiled. "I'm sure it did," I said quietly. He exhaled, the sound carrying a hint of frustration now. "Mom, what's going on?" I looked down at the notebook in front of me, at the careful lines, the numbers, the reality I had finally allowed myself to see, and for a moment, I considered explaining it all, laying it out for him, giving him the opportunity to understand without being forced to. But then I remembered the laughter. The whispers. The name tag. "You'll understand soon," I said instead, my voice calm, steady, leaving no room for argument. "Understand what?" he asked, sharper now. I didn't answer right away. "Because some things aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be revealed." "You'll see," I said softly, and before he could press further, I ended the call. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was intentional. Because for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't reacting to them. I was preparing something they would never forget. The next 2 days passed quietly, at least on the surface, but underneath that calm, everything was shifting into place. I didn't reach out again, and neither did they, not immediately. There was a pause, a kind of uneasy silence that usually never existed between us, as if they were waiting for me to return to normal on my own, to call, to apologize for something I hadn't done, to smooth things over the way I always had before. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, in that still, controlled space I had stepped into, observing, waiting, letting them feel, perhaps for the first time, what it was like when I didn't step forward to fill the gap. On the third day, the message came. Not from my son. From her. "Hi, just checking in. We haven't heard from you. Everything okay?" The tone was polite, carefully neutral, but there was something underneath it, something I recognized now, a subtle pressure wrapped in courtesy. I read it once, then set the phone down without answering right away. I had learned that silence, when used correctly, has a way of revealing more than questions ever could. And right now, I wanted to see how far she would go without getting the response she expected. It didn't take long. Another message followed an hour later, slightly less polished, slightly more direct. "We need to talk about a few things from the wedding. Some expenses still need to be settled." There it was. Not concern. Not curiosity. Not even pretense anymore. Need. Expenses. I picked up the phone again, my thumb hovering over the screen for a moment before I finally replied. "I agree. We should talk." The response came almost instantly. "When can you come by?" I looked at the message, then glanced at the notebook still sitting on my table, the one filled with every detail they had assumed I would never track, never question, never revisit. My eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in the quiet, the order, the life I had built long before they entered it, and something inside me settled even deeper. "Tomorrow afternoon," I typed. "Perfect," she replied. Of course it was. The next day, I arrived exactly on time. Their house looked just as it always had, pristine, curated, every detail carefully arranged to reflect a life that appeared effortless from the outside. I rang the doorbell once, then waited, my posture straight, my expression calm, the same composure I had carried into that ballroom, except this time. I wasn't stepping into their space as a guest. I was stepping in with purpose. She opened the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "There you are," she said, her voice light, almost warm, as if nothing had changed. "We were starting to wonder." "I'm sure you were," I replied evenly. She stepped aside to let me in, and as I walked past her, I caught a faint trace of her perfume, familiar, carefully chosen, just like everything else about her. The living room was already set, my son sitting on the couch, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together, his expression somewhere between concern and impatience. "Mom," he said, standing up quickly, "we've been trying to figure out what's going on." I placed my handbag on the table beside me before taking a seat, unhurried, unbothered, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough that they both had to sit back down before I spoke. "You mentioned expenses," I said calmly, looking at her. She exchanged a quick glance with my son before nodding. "Yes, just a few final things, nothing major, just some adjustments from the wedding. You know how these things go." I held her gaze for a moment, not confrontational, not aggressive, just steady. "Yes," I said softly, "I do know how these things go." I reached into my bag and pulled out the notebook, placing it gently on the table between us. Their eyes followed the movement, curiosity flickering across their faces, though neither of them spoke. "Not yet." I took some time to review everything, I continued, opening the notebook and turning it toward them, each page filled, organized, precise. All the contributions, all the payments, all the adjustments. My son leaned forward first, his brows tightening slightly as he looked down at the numbers, the dates, the details laid out in a way that left no room for interpretation. What is this? He asked. Clarity, I answered. She shifted in her seat, her smile tightening just a fraction. I'm not sure I understand why this is necessary, she said, her tone still controlled, but the ease from earlier already fading. I met her eyes again, and this time I didn't soften it. Because from this point forward, I said, my voice calm, measured, nothing about this will be assumed anymore. The room fell quiet. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that waits. The kind that knows something is about to change. And as I sat there, watching them begin to realize that this conversation was not going to follow the pattern they were used to, I felt something settle into place with complete certainty. They had spent years defining my role without asking me. But that part was over. And what came next was entirely on my terms. My son was the first to react, not loudly, not immediately, but in that subtle way I had come to recognize over the years, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers pressed together just a little harder than before, the shift from casual confidence to something more alert, more defensive. Mom, he said slowly, glancing up from the notebook, this feels a little excessive. It was a wedding, not a business transaction. His tone wasn't harsh, not yet, but there was something underneath it, something that assumed I would pull back, laugh it off, return to the version of myself that made things easy. I didn't. Was it? I asked quietly. That was all. No raised voice, no accusation, just a question placed gently in the space between us, and somehow, that seemed to unsettle him more than anything else could have. She leaned forward slightly then, stepping in the way she always did when conversation started to slip beyond her control. Of course it was a wedding, she said smoothly, her smile returning, polished, practiced. And you were incredibly generous, we've said that many times. But going over every detail like this, it makes it feel like there's a problem when there really isn't one. I looked at her, really looked this time, not as the woman I had welcomed into my family, not as someone I had trusted, but as she was in that moment, composed, careful, always adjusting the narrative just enough to keep herself in control. There is a problem, I said. The words landed softly, but they stayed there. Neither of them spoke right away. So I continued. The problem is not the money, I said, my voice even, measured, and it's not the wedding. It's what the money represents, and how it's been treated. My son exhaled sharply, leaning back slightly as if trying to create distance from the conversation. Mom, you're overthinking this, he said, his tone firmer now. Everyone appreciated what you did. Jennifer was happy, the day was beautiful, that's what matters. Appreciation. Happiness. Beautiful. Words that sound complete, until you realize what they leave out. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting it. And the name tag? I asked. That did it. The shift was immediate. Small, but unmistakable. My son's eyes flicked away for just a second, and she paused. Just long enough. Then the smile came back. Lighter this time. Dismissive. Oh, that, she said with a small laugh, waving her hand slightly as if brushing away something insignificant. It was just a joke. People do that at weddings all the time, it keeps things fun. You're reading too much into it. A joke. I let the word sit there. Then I reached into my bag again, slower this time, more deliberate, and placed the name tag on the table beside the notebook. No explanation. No emphasis. Just evidence. They both looked at it. And for the first time since I walked into that house, neither of them spoke immediately. It wasn't a mistake, I said calmly. And it wasn't random. I looked from one to the other, not searching for guilt, not demanding an answer, just allowing the truth to exist in the room without interruption. I heard what was said, I continued. I saw how people reacted. And more importantly, I saw how neither of you were surprised. My son shifted again, this time more noticeably, his hand moving to the back of his neck in a gesture I hadn't seen since he was a teenager caught between honesty and avoidance. "It wasn't meant to hurt you," he said, quieter now, less certain. "You know that." "Did I?" I studied his face for a moment, the familiarity of it, the years of memories layered into every expression, and for a brief second, I saw the boy he used to be. Then it passed. "Intent doesn't erase meaning," I said gently. Silence followed. Real silence this time. Not waiting. Not defensive. Just still. And in that stillness, something became very clear. They weren't used to this version of me. The one who didn't argue. The one who didn't explain herself. The one who simply stated things as they were and allowed the weight of it to settle. She was the first to break. "Okay," she said, her tone shifting again, less smooth now, more controlled. "So what exactly are you saying? That we owe you something? That this is about repayment?" There it was. The assumption. The simplification. The attempt to bring everything back into a space she could manage. I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. And then I closed the notebook. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just decisively. "This isn't about what you owe me," I continued, my voice steady, my eyes holding hers. "It's about what changes from this point forward." My son frowned slightly, confusion mixing with something else now, something closer to concern. "What do you mean?" I leaned back in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap, the room quiet around us, the air different now, heavier, more aware. "I mean," I said softly, "that everything you thought was certain, isn't anymore." Neither of them spoke. Because somewhere, deep down, they were beginning to understand. Not everything. Not yet. But enough to feel it. The shift. The loss of control. And as I stood up slowly, reaching for my bag, leaving the name tag on the table between us like a final, silent statement, I allowed myself one last glance at both of them. Not angry. Not emotional. Just clear. "You'll find out soon," I said. And this time, I didn't wait for a response. I didn't go home after leaving their house, not immediately, because I knew if I sat in that same quiet space again, I might start thinking in circles instead of forward. Instead, I drove slowly through the neighborhood, past streets I had come to know over the years, houses that looked similar on the outside but held entirely different lives within them. The late afternoon sun stretched long across the pavement, soft, almost peaceful, but inside me, there was no confusion left, only direction. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't reacting to what had happened, I was preparing for what would happen next. By the time I returned home, the air inside felt still, almost expectant, as if the house itself understood that something had shifted. I placed my bag down, removed my shoes, and walked straight to the desk without turning on the lights. The notebook was still there, exactly where I had left it, pages filled with facts that no longer felt heavy, only necessary. I opened it again, not to add anything new, but to review, to make sure every detail was as clear as I remembered, every number precise, every line aligned. Because what I was about to do required certainty, not emotion. My phone buzzed once, then again, then again. This time, I didn't ignore it. Messages from both of them, closer together now, less spaced out, the tone no longer casual, no longer polite, but edged with something sharper. "What did you mean earlier?" "Mom, we need to talk again. You can't just walk out like that without explaining." I read each one slowly, my face calm, my breathing even, because the urgency in their words told me everything I needed to know. They didn't understand yet, but they felt it. The shift. The loss of control. The fact that something had moved beyond their reach. I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I reached for the folder again, the one my husband had prepared years ago, and opened it with steady hands. The document was exactly where it had always been, unchanged, waiting, as if it had simply been paused in time until I was ready to use it. I read through it once more, slower this time, letting every clause settle fully into my understanding, every condition align with the reality I had just lived through. It wasn't complicated, not really, but it was precise. Intentional. Designed not to punish, but to protect. And for the first time I saw it clearly. He had known. Not exactly what would happen, not the details, not the people, but the possibility. The quiet erosion of respect. The way generosity can be mistaken for obligation. The way love, when left unguarded, can slowly be turned into something else entirely. I closed the folder gently. Then I made a call. The conversation was short, direct, exactly the way it needed to be. No emotion, no unnecessary explanation, just confirmation, scheduling, next steps. When I hung up, I placed the phone back on the table and sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me again, but this time, it felt different. Not empty. Not heavy. Resolved. The evening passed quietly, but not idly. I moved through the house with purpose, organizing small things, putting papers in order, preparing in ways that might seem ordinary to anyone else, but to me, each action felt like placing a piece exactly where it belonged. There was no rush, no tension, just a steady progression towards something that was already set in motion. Later that night, another message came through. Short. Direct. From her. We need to resolve this before it becomes a problem. I looked at the screen for a long moment, the words reflecting back at me in the dim light, and I almost smiled. Before it becomes a problem. They still thought this was something forming. Something that could be adjusted. Managed. Contained. They didn't realize. It already was. I set the phone down without replying and turned off the light, the room falling into darkness around me, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. Because this was no longer about what they said, or what they thought, or how they chose to see me. This was about what I had finally decided to do. And by the time they understood that, it would already be too late. The call came the next morning, earlier than I expected, but not sooner than I was ready for. I had just finished pouring my coffee when my phone lit up with my son's name, and for a moment, I simply let it ring, watching it, not avoiding it, just choosing the moment. When I answered, his voice came through immediately, tight, controlled, the way it always did when he was trying to stay calm but wasn't quite succeeding. Mom, we need to talk. Today. There was no softness this time, no attempt to ease into the conversation, just urgency, direct and unmistakable. I agree, I said evenly, taking a slow sip of coffee, my tone giving nothing away. A brief pause followed, just long enough for him to register that I wasn't going to meet his tension with my own. We've been going over everything you said, he continued, and I don't understand what you're trying to do here. This, whatever this is, it's getting out of hand. Out of hand. I let the phrase settle for a second, not reacting to it, just noting it, because it was interesting how quickly something becomes out of hand when it's no longer within someone else's control. It won't take long, I replied calmly. I'll come by this afternoon. This time, he didn't argue. Fine, he said, sharper than before. We'll be here. When I arrived, the atmosphere was different, heavier, tighter, as if the house itself had absorbed the tension that had been building since our last conversation. The door opened almost immediately, and this time, there was no smile waiting for me. She stepped aside without a word, her expression composed but colder now, less concerned with appearances, more focused on outcome. Inside, everything was already arranged. Not casually. Intentionally. My son stood near the center of the room, not sitting, not relaxed, his posture rigid, his attention fixed entirely on me the moment I walked in. There were papers on the table, scattered but purposeful, documents, printouts, things they had clearly gathered in an attempt to regain footing, to reconstruct control over something they didn't fully understand. Sit, he said. Not asked. Said. I did. Calmly. without hesitation. Because I wasn't there to resist. I was there to finish something. We've reviewed the expenses, he began, gesturing toward the papers, and if there's some misunderstanding, we can fix it. But this approach, he exhaled sharply, this isn't necessary. She stepped in then, her voice smoother but edged, controlled but firm. We've always appreciated what you've done, she added, her eyes steady on mine, but turning this into something formal, something legal, it doesn't make sense. We're family. Family. I looked at the papers on the table, then back at them. Yes, I said quietly. That's exactly why it matters. They both paused. Not because they agreed. But because they didn't expect that answer. I reached into my bag, slowly, deliberately, and placed the folder on the table between us. Not the notebook this time. Not notes. Not observations. Something else. Something final. Their eyes moved to it immediately, instinctively, the shift in their attention almost physical, like a current passing through the room. What is that? He asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I opened the folder, turned it toward them, and let the first page rest there, visible, clear, undeniable. Recognition came first. Then confusion. Then something sharper. What is this? He repeated, his voice lower now, less certain. It's already in effect, I said calmly. Silence. Not the kind that waits. The kind that lands. She leaned forward quickly, her composure slipping just slightly as her eyes scanned the page, then the next, then back again, as if looking faster might change what she was reading. No, she said under her breath, then louder, this doesn't make sense. You can't just do this. I met her gaze, steady, unmoved. I didn't just do anything, I replied. My son picked up the document now, his movements sharper, less controlled, his eyes moving quickly across the lines, searching for something, a mistake, a loophole, a way to pull this back into something manageable. There has to be some kind of discussion before something like this, he said, his voice rising slightly, the first crack in his control. You can't make a decision like this without talking to us. I held his gaze. We are talking, I said. Another silence. He looked down at the document again, then back at me, his expression shifting, confusion giving way to something else now, something closer to realization. What does this mean? He asked. This time. I answered. It means, I said softly, that everything connected to me, everything I provided, everything you assumed would always be there, has changed. Neither of them spoke. Because now, they understood enough to feel it. Not the full impact. Not yet. But enough. And as I sat there, watching that understanding begin to take hold, I realized something with complete clarity. This was the moment. Not the wedding. Not the name tag. This. The moment where everything they thought was certain, stopped being theirs. My son stood there, still holding the document, but no longer reading it. His eyes fixed somewhere between the page and me, as if he was trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer matched. Changed how? He asked, his voice lower now, stripped of the certainty he had walked into the room with. It wasn't a challenge anymore, it was a question, one he wasn't sure he wanted the answer to. I didn't rush. I let the silence sit for a moment, just long enough for the weight of that uncertainty to settle in fully before I spoke. It means, I said calmly, that every financial support, every account, every asset connected to my name has been restructured. I kept my tone even, not cold, not emotional, just clear. Access has been removed. Permissions have been updated. And any future involvement will happen only under conditions I decide. She shook her head immediately, the composure from earlier cracking just enough to show what was underneath. That's not reasonable, she said quickly, her voice tightening. You're reacting to something small and turning it into something extreme. This affects more than just you. I'm aware, I replied. That was all. No defense. No explanation. And somehow, that made it worse for them. My son stepped forward slightly, the paper still in his hand, but now it looked more like something he was holding on to rather than something he understood. "Mom, listen to me," he said, his tone shifting again, softer, but strained. "If something upset you, we can fix it. We can talk about it. But doing this," he gestured toward the document, "this isn't the way. Fix it. Talk about it." I looked at him for a long second, not searching for guilt, not searching for anything at all, just seeing him clearly, maybe for the first time in years. "This isn't about fixing a moment," I said quietly. "It's about correcting a pattern." The words landed differently. I could see it. Not fully understood. But felt. She crossed her arms then, her posture closing in, defensive now, no longer trying to smooth things over. "So what, this is punishment?" she asked, her voice sharper. "Because of a joke? Because someone said something at a wedding?" I met her gaze without hesitation. "No," I said. "And I meant it. This is alignment." Another silence followed. He looked down at the document again, then back at me, his expression shifting slowly, piece by piece, as understanding began to form, not just of what I had done, but of what it meant. "What happens now?" he asked. That question was different. Not resistant. Not dismissive. Just real. I stood up slowly, reaching for my bag, my movements unhurried, deliberate, the room quiet around us as both of them watched, waiting for something they could still control. "This," I said, looking at both of them one last time, "is what happens now." And I didn't explain further. Because some things don't need to be explained. They need to be experienced. And as I turned and walked toward the door, leaving them there with the document, with the silence, with the realization that something fundamental had shifted beyond their reach, I knew this wasn't the end of the conversation. It was the beginning of consequences they had never prepared for. I didn't hear anything from them that evening, not a call, not a message, not even the kind of forced politeness they usually used to smooth things over. And that silence told me more than any words could have. Because for the first time, they weren't trying to manage the situation, they were trying to understand it, trying to figure out where they had miscalculated, where the certainty they had relied on had quietly disappeared. I went through my evening the same way I always did, preparing a simple dinner, setting the table out of habit even though I was the only one sitting there, moving through each step calmly, without interruption, without distraction. But underneath that routine, there was something different, something settled, like a final piece had clicked into place. The next morning, the reaction came. Not controlled. Not polished. My phone rang before 8 a.m., and this time I didn't let it ring. I answered. "Mom, what did you do?" My son's voice came through immediately, no greeting, no restraint, just sharp, unsettled, stripped of the composure he had tried to maintain the day before. I could hear movement behind him, drawers opening, papers shifting, the kind of restless energy that comes when someone realizes they are no longer standing on solid ground. "I made a decision," I said calmly. "A decision," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Do you have any idea what this is affecting? Accounts are frozen, transfers are blocked, I can't even access." He stopped himself, but it was already clear, more clear than anything he had said before. Access. That was the word. "That's correct," I replied. Silence. Not confusion this time. Recognition. Then her voice, faint but unmistakable, cutting in from somewhere behind him, sharper, urgent, "Ask her if this is permanent." A pause, then my son again, quieter now, but tighter, controlled in a different way. "Is this permanent?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. Because the answer wasn't complicated. But it mattered. "It is, until I decide otherwise," I said. Another silence. Longer this time. He exhaled slowly, the sound heavy, like something inside him was finally giving way to the reality he had been trying to resist. "Mom," he said again, and now there was something else in his voice, not authority, not frustration, something closer to uncertainty. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." I almost smiled. Because that was the difference. To him, this was becoming bigger. To me, it had already been. "It was always this big," I said quietly. He didn't respond immediately. And I knew why. Because somewhere in that moment, he was starting to see it, not just the action, not just the consequences, but the pattern behind it, the years that led to this point, the things that had been dismissed, minimized, overlooked. "I didn't realize," he started, then stopped. No. He hadn't. And that was exactly the point. "I know," I said. No anger. No blame. Just truth. Behind him, I could hear her again, her voice lower now, but faster, pushing, trying to regain control of something that was no longer available to her. "Tell her this isn't fair," she said. "Tell her she's overreacting." A faint shuffle, then my son again, repeating it, though this time, it didn't sound as certain. "She thinks this isn't fair," he said. I let the words sit for a second. Then I answered. "Fair," I repeated softly. "Would have been being treated like family." That landed. I didn't need to hear their reaction to know it did. The line went quiet, completely now, no background movement, no whispered instructions, just stillness. And in that stillness, something became very clear. They weren't arguing anymore. They were adjusting. Because for the first time, they understood that this wasn't something they could talk their way out of, smooth over, or wait out. This was real. And it wasn't going away. "What do you want us to do?" my son asked finally, his voice lower than before, steadier, but changed. That question was different. I looked out the window, the morning light just beginning to fill the room, soft, steady, unaffected by any of this, and I took a slow breath before answering. "Nothing," I said. A pause. Then, quietly, "Just pay attention." And this time, I ended the call first. Because the lesson had already begun. A week later, I walked back into that same ballroom, not dressed for a celebration this time, not carrying expectations, not carrying hope, just myself. The room looked smaller now, quieter without the music, without the lights, without the illusion that had filled it just days before. A few staff members moved around, clearing the last remnants of an event that had already faded into memory for everyone else, but for me, it had marked the beginning of something I would never forget. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle, letting the space show itself for what it really was, not grand, not perfect, just a room where people had revealed exactly who they were when they thought it didn't matter. And strangely, I felt no anger standing there, no lingering hurt, just clarity, the kind that doesn't need to be proven, doesn't need to be defended, it simply exists once you've seen the truth clearly enough. They had called, of course, more than once over the past few days, the tone changing each time, from confusion to frustration, from frustration to negotiation, from negotiation to something quieter, something closer to caution. But I hadn't rushed to respond, not because I wanted distance, but because for the first time I understood that time itself was part of the lesson. When everything had always been available, always accessible, always given without pause, they had never needed to consider what it meant to lose it. Now, they did. And that understanding couldn't be explained, it had to be experienced, slowly, steadily, until it settled into something real. I walked further into the room, my steps soft against the floor, and for a brief moment, I saw it again, the version of that night that had once felt so important, the laughter, the champagne, the carefully arranged perfection, and then I saw through it, past it, to what had actually been there all along. Not cruelty in its loudest form, not open hostility, but something quieter, something easier to overlook, the kind of disregard that grows slowly, comfortably, until it becomes normal, until no one questions it anymore. That was what had changed. Not them. Not the past. Me. I had finally stopped accepting what I had been given, and started recognizing what I deserved. I reached into my bag and took out the name tag one last time, holding it between my fingers, the same delicate card, the same elegant lettering, unchanged, and yet, completely different from the moment I first saw it. Back then, it had been a label, something placed on me without my consent, something meant to define me in a way I had never agreed to. But now, it was just paper. Meaningless. Powerless. Because the only reason it had ever held weight was because I had allowed it to. I looked at it for a second longer, then set it down on one of the empty tables, not with anger, not with ceremony, just finality. A quiet ending. Because I didn't need to carry it anymore. As I turned toward the exit, the light from outside spilling gently into the room, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, not relief, not victory, something deeper than that, something steadier. Ownership. Of my choices. Of my boundaries. Of myself. They had thought I was just an old woman, someone who would always give, always adjust, always stay in the place they had quietly assigned to me. They were wrong. And the truth is, I didn't need to prove it to them. I just needed to live it. So I walked out of that ballroom the same way I had walked into it days before, calm, composed, silent, but this time, there was nothing left behind me, no confusion, no doubt, no version of myself waiting to be reclaimed. Only forward. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough.